Gildan Media presents Your Coach in a Box, affordable, life-changing audio programs. Abraham Lincoln, A Life, by Michael Burlingame. Read by Sean Pratt. Lincoln's frontier background shapes the future president. 1809 to 1837. Chapter 1. I have seen a good deal of the backside of this world. Childhood in Kentucky, 1809 to 1816. One day in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln stole time from his busy schedule to pen some wise, paternal advice to a young Union captain who had been squabbling with his superiors. Quoting from Hamlet, the president wrote that a father's admonition to his son, "Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it, that the opposed may beware of thee," was good counsel, and yet not the best. Instead, Lincoln enjoined the captain, "Quarrel not at all." The reasons Lincoln gave were practical. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield larger things to which you can show no more than equal right, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. Better give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. Born in emotional and economic poverty, Lincoln early on resolved to make the most of himself, and did so, adhering to those precepts. Ancestry. Like many exceptional children of unexceptional parents, Lincoln was quite curious about his ancestors, especially his grandfathers, neither of whom he knew. He was so intrigued that he planned to conduct genealogical research after he left the presidency. In 1858, when asked about his forebears, he revealed more than a passing acquaintance with his family tree. "I believe the first of our ancestors we know anything about was Samuel Lincoln, who came from Norwich, England, in 1638, and settled in a small Massachusetts place called Hingham, or it might have been called Hangham." Lincoln loved wordplay. In two brief autobiographical sketches written for the campaign of 1860, he devoted much space to his lineage. The following year, Lincoln told a Yorkshireman that he planned to visit England, the home of his ancestors. His father's father was known as Captain Abraham, a rank he attained in 1776 while serving in the Virginia militia. Born in 1744 in Pennsylvania, the future captain moved with his father, John, and the rest of their family to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia around 1766. They settled along Linville Creek in Augusta, later Rockingham County, where John Lincoln farmed a tract of 600 acres, one-third of which he sold to his son Abraham in 1773. The following year, Abraham participated in Lord Dunmore's expedition against the Shawnees, and during the Revolution he joined General Lachlan McIntosh's feudal campaign against Fort Detroit. For unknown reasons, in 1780, the captain departed with his wife and children on a 250-mile trek to the remote and dangerous Indian hunting grounds of Kentucky, while the Revolutionary War still raged, and attacks on settlers were common. In 1784 alone, Indians killed more than 100 migrants traveling the Wilderness Road from Virginia to Kentucky, which was little more than a trail first blazed by Daniel Boone in 1775. Perhaps Grandfather Abraham wished to avoid taxes, or he may have been lured westward by the prospect of easy gains in land speculation. His decision to sell a large farm in western Virginia for paper money showed bad judgment because the soil there was so fertile that German pioneer settlers had made the area highly productive. Captain Abraham's inability to thrive in Virginia suggests that he may have been shiftless. Captain Abraham died a violent death on the dark and bloody ground of frontier Kentucky. As a boy, the future president often heard this harrowing tale, which he called the legend more strongly than all others imprinted upon my mind and memory. Working his farm one spring day in 1786, the 42-year-old grandfather Abraham was ambushed by an Indian, who shot him dead before the terrified eyes of his young son, Thomas, father-to-be of the 16th president. As the Indian prepared to kidnap the lad, his older brother, Mordecai, dashed back to the family cabin, grabbed a rifle, aimed at the silver ornament dangling from the Indian's neck, and squeezed the trigger. Luckily for Thomas, his brother's aim was true, and the boy escaped unharmed, at least physically. The Indian may have belonged to a tribe the captain had battled during his militia service. Lincoln's opinion of his namesake grandfather is not recorded, but he may well have admired him. Some gifted children with disappointing fathers romanticize their grandfathers, even if they scarcely knew them. In an 1861 speech to New Jersey legislators, Lincoln paid glowing tribute to the soldiers of the Revolution, and Captain Abraham may have been a lifelong source of inspiration to Lincoln as he strove to make the most of himself. In a campaign biography that Lincoln himself read and corrected, William Dean Howells asserted that his subject had the stubborn notion that because the Lincolns had always been people of excellent sense, he, a Lincoln, might become a person of distinction. What Lincoln knew about his other grandfather is hard to say. Lincoln once described him as a Virginia planter or large farmer who took sexual advantage of a poor, credulous young woman named Lucy Hanks, granddaughter of William Lee, a plantation overseer accused of beating a slave to death. The fruit of that union was Nancy Hanks, mother of the future president. From this aristocratic progenitor, Lincoln believed that he inherited his power of analysis, his logic, his mental activity, his ambition, and all the qualities that distinguished him from the other members and descendants of the Hanks family. This grandfather's identity, unknown to history, may well have been known to Lincoln, who was acquainted with several members of the Hanks family, including two great aunts who had been born in Virginia before or during the Revolution, and also his great-uncle Billy Hanks, father of Lincoln's rail-splitting partner, John Hanks. The Hankses played a long-lasting role in Lincoln's life, caring for his beloved stepmother until her death in 1869. It seems likely that the Hanks family would have shared with Abe what they knew about Nancy Hanks's father. Lincoln's description of his aristocratic grandsire represents a variation of the family romance phenomenon, which causes some children to speculate that they are actually the offspring of more distinguished parents than the ones who raised them. Most people outgrow these fantasies, but some adults, including exceptional people or men with very distant fathers, tend to maintain an unusually strong sense of family romance throughout life. Lincoln fits this category on both counts, for he was truly exceptional and had a distant relationship with his father. Father Thomas. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was quite undistinguished. As his son later wrote, "By the early death of his father, and very narrow circumstances of his mother, even in childhood, Thomas was a wandering, laboring boy." Born around 1776 in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, he moved with his parents and 4 siblings to Kentucky in 1780. Finding most land in the fertile bluegrass region already taken, the Lincolns pushed on to the hard-scrabble terrain between the Cumberland and Green Rivers, where they established a farm. Later, evidently fearing hostile Indians in that remote locale, they moved to a site on Long Run in Jefferson County. There they lived in a stockade, 18 miles from Louisville. After Captain Abraham's death, his widow, Bathsheba, and their children resettled in Washington County, where they would be safer. Bathsheba later stayed with her daughter Nancy, wife of William Brumfield, who owned a large farm near Hardinsburg in Breckinridge County. After Bathsheba's son, Thomas, bought a farm in 1803 on Mill Creek, she and the Brumfields moved in. 3 years later, the Brumfields purchased 225 acres a few miles to the north, where they built a log house. Bathsheba, the shrewdest and most intelligent member of the family, prodded both her rather lazy son-in-law and young Thomas, hiring the latter out for good wages. The documentary record reveals little about Thomas's activities in the decade after his father's death. Under the law of primogeniture, his eldest son, Mordecai, inherited everything from the paternal estate, which included a few hundred acres in Kentucky. Mordecai may have treated his younger brother unkindly. Emily Todd Helm, half-sister of Mary Todd Lincoln, said that the reason why Thomas Lincoln grew up unlettered was that his brother Mordecai, having all the land in his possession, turned Thomas out of the house when the latter was 12 years old, so he went out among his relations, and the Berries and others, and there grew up. In 1795, Thomas served in the Kentucky militia for a month, and the following year he worked on a mill dam in Hardin County. While laboring there, he lived with his father's cousin, Hananiah Lincoln, a resident of Elizabethtown, 45 miles southwest of Louisville. Thomas and Hananiah remained in that village only until 1789, when they evidently headed south to Cumberland County. While in that region, Thomas spent time in Tennessee with his prosperous uncle, Isaac Lincoln, whose only child had died quite young. Thomas might have become a surrogate son, but Isaac disapproved of young Tom's indolence and improvidence. Returning to Kentucky the following year, Thomas shuttled back and forth between Washington and Cumberland counties. In 1802, he moved to Hardin County, where his name appeared on the tax lists for the next 14 years. In 1803, he purchased a 238-acre farm on Mill Creek where he lived while working in nearby Elizabethtown, a hamlet whose population in 1810 numbered 181. How Thomas could afford to buy that farm is unclear. Perhaps his brother Mordecai shared some of his patrimony with him after Thomas attained his majority, or Thomas may have purchased the Mill Creek property with the savings his mother had set aside from the wages he earned when she hired him out. 3 years after he bought the Mill Creek farm, Thomas journeyed to New Orleans. On June 12, 1806, shortly after returning from Louisiana, he married Nancy Hanks in a ceremony that took place near Poor Town in Washington County. Following a brief honeymoon, the newlyweds moved to Elizabethtown, where their first child, Sarah, was born less than 8 months after her parents' wedding. A journalist described their residence as a shed, almost bare of household fittings and quite unfit for a human dwelling place. Why the couple did not live on the Mill Creek property is a mystery. Nancy, perhaps, wished to be closer to her family than to her husband's relatives. She may have been lonely in Elizabethtown, where she had no kin, and perhaps for that reason at the end of 1807, Thomas moved 14 miles to a rock-strewn spread in the Barrens on the South Fork of Nolan Creek, known as the Sinking Spring Farm. It was near the homestead where Thomas and Betsy Sparrow, who raised Nancy, lived with their foster child, Dennis Hanks, and where Nancy's Aunt Polly Hanks' friend had settled. Thomas gambled when he chose that site, for rather than a deed he purchased a title bond, an assignment of someone's contested right to the land. He would own the property only if others met their financial obligations. Dennis Hanks, a cousin who lived with the Lincolns for 3 years during Abe's youth, reported that Thomas couldn't make a living by his trade of carpentry. There was scarcely any money in the country. So Tom took up some land, mighty poor land, but the best he could get when he hadn't much to trade for it. Thomas Lincoln may have left Elizabethtown for Nolan Creek because he believed his reputation as a carpenter had been damaged when an influential citizen sued him for shoddy work. The nearest settlement, 2.5 miles to the south, was in the vicinity of Hodgen's Mill. On February 12, 1809, in a cabin that an observer called a miserable habitation, Nancy delivered a baby boy, who was named Abraham, after Thomas's father. The Lincolns remained in Kentucky until 1816, when they removed to Indiana. There, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died 2 years later. Thomas remarried in 1819, and 11 years afterwards, he moved to Illinois, where he would remain until his death in 1851. He had known more than his fair share of hardship and sorrow. Thomas Lincoln shared only a few things in common with his son. Both were able wrestlers, as well as good-natured, humorous, and gifted storytellers. A surviving example of Thomas's humor concerns his second wife, who allegedly remarked one day, "We have lived together a long time, and you have never told me whom you like best, your first wife or me?" He responded, "Oh, now, Sarah, that reminds me of old John Hardin down in Kentucky, who had a fine-looking pair of horses, and a neighbor coming in one day and looking at them said, 'John, which horse do you like best?' John replied, 'I can't tell. One of them kicks and the other bites, and I don't know which is worst.'" But the qualities that would make Abraham Lincoln famous, his intellectual power, ambition, idealism, eloquence, spirituality, integrity, political wisdom, judgment, leadership, were lacking in Thomas. Henry C. Whitney, to whom Lincoln described his childhood, said that from Thomas Lincoln his son inherited only infancy, ignorance, and indigence. Few of Thomas's neighbors could remember anything special about him other than that he was a plain, unpretending, plodding man, a good, average man, who attended to his work, and was among the very commonest of the plain pioneers, honest and harmless, illiterate, yet always truthful, conscientious, and religious, and peaceable good. Thomas evidently could read a little, but was unable to write anything other than his signature. Unlike his tall, rangy son, Thomas was thick, weighing between 180 and 200 pounds. He was a bit stoop-shouldered, somewhat clumsy as he walked, and strong. Dennis Hanks found it remarkable that Thomas, though not a fleshy man, was built so compact that it was difficult to find or feel a rib in his body. Thomas had dark gray eyes, a low forehead, heavy eyebrows, a sharp chin, and an unusually big Roman nose, which was his most prominent feature. He was indifferent to clothes, and his taste in food was simple, two traits he also shared with his son. His whole appearance, said one neighbor, denoted a man of small intellect and less ambition, and such he was. If Thomas lacked intellectual power and driving ambition, he impressed people favorably as honest and sociable, slow to take offense, with a lot of common sense. Though he seldom had a cross word for anyone, he did use profanity occasionally. When his young daughter repeated an oath of his, he received a scolding from his wife and never swore again. One day during his presidency, Lincoln used the expression, "by jings," while visiting the telegraph office. When asked about that expression, he apologized to the operators for his profanity, explaining that "by jings" is swearing, for my good old mother taught me that anything that had a "by" before it is swearing. When Lincoln's friend William G. Greene visited Thomas in 1836, he found his manners backwoods-ish, but was charmed by his wit and humor and thought him a mighty hospitable and a very entertaining host. For all his humor, Thomas could be taciturn and moody. He often became depressed and withdrew into himself, sometimes wandering out in the barrens for hours on end. Bouts of depression would hardly be surprising in a man who, as a boy, had witnessed his father's murder, and then endured wandering, rootless poverty, and hard labor. Other losses, recurring financial setbacks, and the deaths of his second son in 1813, of his wife in 1818, and of his daughter in 1828, deepened his dejection. He frequently said, "Everything that I ever touched either died, got killed, or was lost." On other occasions he lamented, "It's the hand of Providence laid upon me." Thomas's susceptibility to depression may have been in part genetic. His brother Mordecai and his sons were known as men who at a time communed with themselves, absorbed in their own thoughts. Prone to melancholia, depression, and gloomy spells called the horrors, Mordecai allegedly would come into his mother's house and sit down for long periods of time without saying a word, unless it were to mutter an oath against something or curse somebody. He would sometimes take up his violin and pace the floor. The horrors resembled bouts of delirium tremens, and may in fact have been the result of heavy drinking, for he reportedly exercised the privilege very common in those days of indulging freely whenever he pleased, which happened very often. He also betrayed signs of paranoia, accusing Catholics of stealing his father's land, and over time his hatred of Roman priests intensified. Many other members of the family had moody spells. Mary Rowena Lincoln, mother of Thomas's nephew James Lincoln, was reportedly a victim of the Lincoln hippo, that is, hypo or depression. Benjamin Mudd, son of Elizabeth Lincoln Mudd, suffered from what was called the Lincoln horrors. An uncle of Thomas's confessed to a court that he suffered from a deranged mind. Another relative in the same area, Mary Jane Lincoln, was committed to the Illinois Hospital for the Insane after a court hearing in which a jury determined that the disease is with her hereditary. She had gone insane in 1854 at the age of 26, was committed to the state asylum in 1867, and died there 21 years later. Thomas Lincoln prospered neither as a carpenter nor a farmer. He learned woodworking from Nancy Hanks's uncle, Joseph Hanks, Jr., and made his living as a cabinet and house carpenter until he wed. Thereafter, he supplemented his income by farming. His carpentry skills were so rudimentary that people called him a rough and cheap carpenter, who could only put doors, windows, and floors in log houses, and do a tolerable job of joining. He continued working as a carpenter after he moved to Indiana, making tables, coffins, doors, and window casings. He worked when jobs came to him, but would not seek them out. Some customers were unhappy with his work. In 1807, Denton Gahagan of Elizabethtown refused to pay Thomas for hewing timbers for his sawmill. Some timbers were too short, others too long. Thomas sued for his fee and won. Thomas was even less successful as a farmer, partly because he chose unpromising land to till. The Nolan Creek property, birthplace of the future president, had poor soil except in a few small patches. When, in 1811, Thomas abandoned that farm, after the owner took title and refused to lease the property to him, he moved to equally unpromising terrain on Knob Creek, 9 miles away. In 1816, he attempted to make a fresh start in Indiana, and, unwisely, selected 160 heavily timbered acres. He also built his cabin more than a mile from a reliable water source. He showed similarly bad judgment in Illinois in the 1830s and 1840s. Even if he had selected land more shrewdly, Thomas lacked the industry, ambition, and intellect to prosper. As Dennis Hanks put it, Thomas was a man who took the world easy and never thought that gold was God. Hanks's son-in-law was more blunt. Thomas, he declared, was very careless about his business, a poor manager, at times accumulated considerable property which he always managed to make way with about as fast as he made it, and was what is generally called an unlucky man in business. In 1835, Thomas and 4 partners leased a mill for a year. When they failed to pay the agreed-upon rent, they were successfully sued. Several times Thomas took boatloads of pork and other goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, usually making little money. In a particularly unfortunate transaction, he was cheated out of the entire load. His son Abraham described that calamity. Father often told me of the trick that was played upon him by a pair of sharpers. It was in 1815, the year before we moved from Kentucky to Indiana, that Father concluded to take a load of pork down to New Orleans. He had a considerable amount of his own, and he bargained with the relatives and neighbors for the pork, so that altogether he had quite a load. He took the pork to the Ohio River on a clumsily constructed flatboat of his own make. Almost as soon as he pushed out into the river, a couple of sleek fellows bargained with him for his cargo, and promised to meet him in New Orleans, where they arranged to pay him the price agreed upon. He eagerly accepted the offer, transferred the cargo to the strangers, and drifted down the river, his head filled with visions of wealth and delight. He thought that he was going to accomplish what he had set out to do without labor or inconvenience. Father waited about New Orleans for several days, but failed to meet his whilom friends. At last it dawned upon him that he had been sold, and all that he could do was to come back home and face the music. Thomas Lincoln also lost money buying and selling farms, especially in Kentucky, where an archaic surveying system, which permitted claims to be identified by trees, stones, creek bends, and other such imprecise landmarks, produced chaos, leading to innumerable lawsuits. Kentucky law did not require a qualifying examination for surveyors, who reportedly were never correct except by accident. Years later, Lincoln recalled how Kentuckians used to be troubled with mysterious relics of feudalism, and titles got into such an almighty mess with these pettifogging encumbrances turning up at every fresh trading with the land, and no one knowing how to get rid of 'em. Because the size of the Mill Creek farm was unclear, Thomas was able to sell it for only £100, though he had paid £118 for it a decade earlier. For $200, he purchased a title bond to the 300-acre Nolan Creek farm and lost it all, including the value of the improvements he had made on the property. He was ejected from the 30-acre Knob Creek farm, which he had leased, not purchased. Memories of his family's trouble with land titles may have predisposed Lincoln to become a surveyor and a lawyer. As an attorney, he advised young men aspiring to the bar, "Never stir up litigation. A worse man can scarcely be found than one who does this. Who can be more nearly a fiend than he who habitually overhauls the register of deeds in search of defects and titles, whereon to stir up strife, and put money in his pocket?" Thomas fared just as badly in Indiana. First, he squatted on a 160-acre tract of government land for 10 months, and then bought it, on credit, for $320. Thomas probably delayed making a down payment for the same reason that most pioneers did: lack of cash. In 1817, he put down $80, but over the following decade, he made no further payments. In 1827, he relinquished half the farm, reducing his debt to $80, which he met by turning over to the government title to 80 acres in a distant county, a property that he had mysteriously acquired 4 weeks earlier. In 1830, he sold this $160 farm for $125. When, a decade later, Thomas found himself unable to meet obligations he had assumed for 4 parcels of Illinois land, his generous son Abraham gave him what amounted to a gift of $200 for a 50-acre tract that had cost Thomas only $50. Shortly thereafter, Abraham again rescued his father by paying off a mortgage that Thomas had assumed. Thomas made scant use of the land he occupied, usually clearing only a few acres for a garden and a corn patch. At Knob Creek, he cultivated only 6 acres along the creek in a strip about 40 feet wide on either side. He worked enough to sustain life, and no more. For the most part, Thomas avoided the market economy, remaining a subsistence farmer. He did, however, grow a little tobacco, which he peddled for 10 cents a pound. On at least one occasion, he offered that commodity to satisfy a debt on a horse he had bought on credit. The creditor, impressed that a man would part with his tobacco to pay what he owed, forgave the $10. According to Thomas's stepson-in-law, John J. Hall, Thomas Lincoln did not improve with age, nor with increasing responsibilities. He was still the same kind and genial fellow, but grew more and more shiftless and good-for-nothing as the years rolled on. At the rocky Nolan Creek farm, Hall reported, he did not cultivate the soil, nor fix up the old shanty. In Illinois, Tom, along with his stepson, John D. Johnston, and Johnston's 5 sons, tilled only 40 of their 120 acres. In an area where the average farm was worth $1,600, Tom valued his farm at $100 in the 1850 census, even though he was older than his neighbors, had had time to accumulate more property, and had a large number of family hands to work the land. Thomas ranked behind 79% of his neighbors in terms of wealth. George B. Balk, an Illinois neighbor, noted that while most farmers took their crops to market in a wagon, Tom Lincoln used a basket or a large tray. Balk characterized Thomas as uneducated, illiterate, and contented with a from-hand-to-mouth living. In some
Sample complete. Ready to continue?